I'm doing a read aloud of The Boys' War by Jim Murphy. We're on Chapter 6, Home Sweet Home, on page 55. The camp of the Union Army at Cumberland Landing, Virginia. Boys in the Civil War found themselves challenged constantly by older soldiers, the quest for food, enemy fire, and their longing for home. And as we've seen, they usually found an inventive solution to deal with whatever came their way. The same was true for their efforts to create a home away from home. Making a physical home was not always easy for soldiers. During warm weather, they spent a great deal of time marching from one field of the battle to the next, usually camping for no longer than 2 or 3 days. A simple canvas tent that sheltered anywhere from 4 to 10 men was home, but sometimes even a tent was hard to come by. Charles Knott recalls how he and his 3 friends spent the snowy winter night. We managed to find 4 blankets, 2 of them wet and frozen, and buffalo skin. The snow was scraped away from the windward side of the fire, and the frozen blankets were laid on the ground. A log was rolled up for a windbreak, and the buffalo skin spread over the blankets. On this, 4 of us were stretched, and very close and straight we had to lie. Exposed to the falling snow, Knott and his 3 buddies covered themselves with 2 dry blankets and fell into a sound sleep. They would have had a perfect night's sleep, except for an unexpected problem. The warmth of their bodies plus the heat from the fire began to thaw the hard ground. The wetness from the ground began to seep between the blankets, and soon they could not sleep there any more. Fortunately, they were clever enough to solve this new problem. We bent down a couple of saplings and spread blankets over them, making a little shed. Under this we crept, after piling plenty of wood upon our fire. The soldier's invariable comfort, his pipe, was at hand, and thus we chatted, smoked, and dozed until daylight. Knott was lucky. He was able to find blankets and wood for his fire. Elisha Stockwell found himself without either one time. Stockwell's company had followed a group of Confederate soldiers across a rough terrain for 2 days. The supply wagons could not keep up with the soldiers' movement, so when they finally turned around to head back to camp, all that they had was what they were carrying. Stockwell picks up his story here. We marched back toward Corinth in the cold, drizzly rain, and I didn't have my blankets. I was wet through. I suffered that night, as we only had green wood to make a fire. It stopped raining, so my clothes got partly dried. I laid down on the wet ground to sleep, but I would get so cold that I would have to get up and hover over the smoky fire. I put in about the most disagreeable night of my life. A few days later, Stockwell developed a fever and fainted while drilling with his company. I was shaking with the ague. They called it malaria fever nowadays. As long as I was in the army, and nearly a year after I got home, I had it every time I caught cold. Despite the dismal weather, winter was the best time to make a home. Few large scale battles were planned, which meant that the soldiers of both armies could expect to be camped in one place for several months in a row. When the winter quarters when in winter quarters, soldiers rushed to construct solid structures using trees and branches, barrels, pieces of wrecked wagons, discarded crates, burlap, and even rocks and mud as building materials. Thomas Galloway helped construct an impressive winter home in 1863. In general, each hut is made to accommodate a non commissioned officer from 8 to 12 enlisted men, Galloway remembered. The walls, which are made of logs, are 12 to 20 feet long, from 8 to 10 feet wide, and about 5 feet high. In the middle of each end, a forked stick supports the crosspiece. Over this is stretched the shelter tents of all the men buttoned together. Usually 2 thicknesses of tents are spread. This roof keeps us out of rain and snow. The chimneys are sometimes made of sticks piled crosswise upon one another. Sometimes, and in fact more often, they are of pork barrels from the commissary. Winter camp in the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry at Brandy Station, Virginia. Furnishing insides were plain and functional. Barrels could be used to store food or, when empty, turned upside down to serve as tables or chairs. There wasn't enough room for beds or large tables, and the bathroom was a dug hole in the ground several yards from the shelter. Galloway does record one bit of decoration. The walls are covered with illustrated papers and with pictures cut from them. And what are most sought after for this purpose are colored fashion plates in the ladies' magazines. As hardly any women are ever seen, the images of attractive women are put where the boys can feast their eyes upon them. When Galloway and his friends were able to build a solid and somewhat cozy winter structure, most shelters were crudely constructed, extremely cramped and drafty. There are numerous accounts of shelters collapsing under the burden of heavy snow or blown apart by strong gusts of wind. This happened most often to Confederate soldiers in the South when supplies were short. John Delaney and two of his friends were only able to build a shack 6 feet long and 5 feet wide before the snow and ice made further improvements impossible. Delaney tells about the cramped sleeping conditions. We have but 4 blankets between us, so we must manage economically. The way we adapt is for all three to sleep together, lying on one blanket and covering with the other three. This arrangement is all very well with respect to the length of the blankets, but the width is another matter. Provided we all lie in the same position, the blankets cover us snugly enough. But if one takes a different position from the other two, the blanket fails to accommodate all. How did they solve this chilly problem? Delaney continues his story. We made the following agreement. We shall all go to sleep in the same position, and if during the night one wishes to turn over, he must do so not without giving previous warning. So now, when some one of us wakes up and wishes for a change of base, he wakes up the others and announces his purpose. Thereupon, the man in the middle gives the command right or left turn, and the movement is made promptly without disorder. Camp life with all its comrades, or with all of its comforts and discomforts, created a lasting bond between the soldiers. In a real way, this shared experience made the other soldiers company, both his family and his friends. When a soldier wasn't being drilled or on guard duty, his time was pretty much on his own to do with what he pleased. Many would sleep the day away, or read the latest books and illustrated magazines sent from home. Others would play checkers, write letters home, search for food, or gather in small groups to sing. The most popular pastime seems to have been gambling. Card playing was most common form of gambling, but Civil War, Union soldiers relaxing in the field. Some are reading letters from home, while others study newspapers, chat, smoke their pipes, or play checkers. And of course, card playing was the favorite way to pass the time. But the Civil War soldiers were quick to invent other schemes for betting. For a nickel, a soldier could buy a raffle ticket. If his ticket was drawn from a hat, he might win a cash prize of $5, or a watch, or maybe even a chicken. Racing was also a favorite pastime. Horse races would bring out hundreds of soldiers to wager on and cheer for their favorite. Foot races between companies was just as popular and noisy. But horses and men weren't the only things capable of racing. One company painted a round race course on a piece of tent canvas, and they had louse races on it. Gambling was so common in camp that new recruits were often shocked by it. One boy, J.E. Hall, wrote to his father in July of 1861, "A young man cannot guard himself too closely in camp. Where to be considered an accomplished gentleman, it is necessary to be a scientific and successful gambler." To counter the bad influences of camp life, ministers and priests often wandered among the men, reading from the Bible and urging listeners to repent of their sins. This practice was especially common in the Confederacy, where the Great Revival swept over the army in the opening months of 1863. A minister from that time estimated that 150,000 soldiers got religion that year. One Confederate soldier named Benjamin Jones wrote to a friend about it. "I hear that a great religious spirit and revival is spreading throughout Lee's army, and there are evidence of it here. In the other camps about Richmond, many of them openly sinful are growing more temperate and reverent in their conversation and regarding for religious things. There is less cursing and profligacy, and much less card playing in our company." John Delaney also commented on this new religious spirit. "The ministers of the different regiments are now on the alert, and prayer meetings and preaching are beginning to be quite common. Every evening before dusk, the chaplains begin preaching, and for miles around, you might hear thousands of voices singing hymns." A priest says Mass for the 69th New York State Militia in 1861. When the preachers came around, most soldiers put aside their cards and joined in the service out of respect. But after a while, the initial fever began to wane, and many soldiers grew impatient with the ceaseless lecturing. In time, soldiers began drifting back to their old ways. Ruffin Thompson, in shock, wrote to his mother, "Yesterday was Sunday, and I sat at my fire and saw preachers holding forth and about 30 steps off, and between them and me were 2 games of poker, and where each one was trying to fill their pockets at the expense of his neighbor. Money was a preoccupation of all Civil War soldiers. Most of the boys came from poor families where $5 was considered a great deal of money. Gambling gave them a chance to make that much money and more with little physical effort. In addition, money was needed to buy supplies not provided by the army from soldiers or stores. Of course, whenever an army arrived in an area, the price of everything shot up. This intensified the need for cash and heightened the lengths to which soldiers would go to earn it. Elisha Stockwell stumbled upon a lucrative business when he was camped in the South. Stockwell and another boy his age discovered that they could buy $1 of Confederate money from Union soldiers for just 3 cents, and then sell it to the Southern citizens in town for 10 cents. In just one day, he and his new business partner earned almost $40. But then they got greedy. We bought some we bought some of a Wisconsin boy that was printed on a white paper. It was just an imitation of Reb's money, but it wasn't signed. We colored the paper with coffee and got Nate Clapp of my company, who was a good penman, to sign it. We had a genuine bill for a sample and it passed all right, but the Reb citizen we sold it to found out it was counterfeit and wouldn't buy any more from the Yanks. So we ruined our business by being dishonest. Civil War soldiers also loved practical jokes. They would poke fun at each other, at passing civilians, and even at an officer if the mood struck them. Even during the height of the religious movement, a good practical joke was always appreciated. In the same letter in which he mentions the great religious spirit, Benjamin Jones devoted a great deal of space to what he referred to as one of the little comedies. As a few of the tents had been fixed up with rude dirt chimneys for fireplaces, and Sergeant Pons was one of these, it gave the boys a fine chance to play their game. And so one night, one of the smallest among the men, with a bucket of water in hand, was lifted up by a big, strong fellow to the top of the little stick chimney, just as the choir rang out the alarm by singing, "Scotland's burning, cast on water." The little fellow on the chimney cast his bucket of water down upon the fire inside, which deluged the whole fireplace, put out the fire, and scattered the embers in every direction. Of course, too, it put a stop to the song and sent the men quickly out of the tent after the offenders, but not in time to discover who they were. This sense of fun even applied to the enemy from time to time. One of the true oddities of the Civil War was the amount of fraternization that went on between the Union and the Confederate soldiers. It makes perfect sense, however, when you consider that they all spoke the same language, held similar religious beliefs, and were raised with the same historical heroes. Elisha Stockwell recalled what happened in 1863 after a failed attempt to storm Confederate fortifications outside Vicksburg. After this, we dug up to them. It was 2 rods from the outside of our fort to the outside of the Rebs' fort. Moonlit nights, they used to agree to have a talk, and both sides would get up on the breastworks and blackguard each other and laugh and sing songs for an hour at a time, and then get down to commence to shooting again. Thatcher Rise was also at Vicksburg and remembered this remarkable scene. "Here's a group of 4 played cards, 2 Yanks and 2 Rebs. There, others were jumping, while everywhere blue and gray mingled in conversation over the scenes which had transpired since our visit to the neighborhood. I talked with a very sensible rebel, who said that he was satisfied we should not only take Vicksburg, but drive the forces of the South all over their territory, at last compelling them to surrender. Still, he said, he had gone into the fight and was resolved not to back out. More than conversation was exchanged at these times, as Rise makes clear. From remarks of some of the Rebs, I judged that their supply of provisions was getting low, and that they had no source from which to draw more. We gave them from our own rations some fat meat, crackers, coffee, and so forth. Such contacts undercut some of the animosity and bitterness between the armies. The enemy, it turned out, was human after all, and could be kind and generous as well. Fraternization did not stop the fighting, but it did lead Civil War soldiers to respect their opponents and may have contributed to the remarkable lack of revenge sought at the end of the war. Telegraph operators resting after the Battle of Gettysburg. Most of the free time a soldier had was spent with small groups of his friends huddled around the fire. John Delaney paints a vivid picture of what his company did on a typical night. After the evening repast, they lie around the blazing log and talk of their various campaigns, or perhaps speak of their loved ones at home, wonder how long it will be before they greet them again, and then they may grow silent and gaze into the glowing embers of the fire, and picture to themselves the forms of early years, the shapes and scenes of bygone days, build castles in the flames, and sigh and long for the time when the war's loud roar shall cease and peace again pervade their homes. The fire's flames would die down, and the men would wander back to their tents or huts to sleep. Camp life had its pleasant, peaceful moments, but inevitably the sun would rise up to warm the countryside, and the fighting would begin again.